We're going to begin, though, with the situation in Bucha up here. We're going to start with CNN's Frederick Pleiken and the horror he found there. We do want to warn you, some of the images you're about to see are graphic.
Ukrainian authorities in Bucha lead us into a basement they call a Russian execution chamber. It's a gruesome scene. 5 bodies, their hands tied behind their backs, shot. The bullet casings collected by Ukrainian police, pockmarks from bullets in the walls. The Ukrainians say these men were killed when Russian forces used this compound as a military base while occupying Bucha. An advisor to Ukraine's interior minister not even trying to conceal his anger. After the liberation of Bucha, 5 corpses of civilians were found here, he says, with their hands tied behind their backs. They were shot in the head and in the chest. They were tortured before. Even the body collectors find it hard to keep their composure. Vladislav Minchenko is usually a painter. Now he collects the dead left behind after Russian forces retreated from Bucha. This is not what we learned in school, he says. Do you see my hands? Hundreds of dead. Hundreds, not dozens. The Kremlin has denied Russia was behind any atrocities in Bucha. Now, the Russians say the notion of their troops having killed civilians is all fake news and propaganda, but it does seem clear that they were here. That looks like a sort of foxhole position, and over there they seem to have dug in a tank. On the outer wall, the letter V, a symbol that Russian forces painted on their vehicles before invading this part of Ukraine. Now, a lot of Russian military hardware lies destroyed in the streets of Bucha and other towns around Kiev, as the Ukrainians made a stand and prevented Vladimir Putin's army from entering the capital city. Images published shortly after Russian forces left Bucha show many corpses lying in the streets. Some bodies had their hands tied behind their backs. President Biden calls what happened here a war crime. While visiting Bucha, Ukraine's president vowed to bring those behind the violence against civilians to justice. These are war crimes, he says, and they will be recognized by the world as genocide. You are here, and you can see what happened. We know that thousands of people were killed and tortured, teared limbs, raped women, and killed children. And still, the dead keep piling up. Many lay in this mass grave behind the main church in Bucha. Local authorities tell us around 150 people are buried here, but no one knows the exact number. And here, too, the scenes are tragic. Vladimir has been searching for his younger brother, Dmitry. Now he's convinced Dmitry lies here, even though he can't be 100% sure. The neighbor accompanying him has strong words for the Russians. Why do you hate Ukraine so much, she says. Since the 1930s, you've been abusing Ukraine. You just wanted to destroy us. You wanted us gone. But we will be. Everything will be okay. I believe it. But more corpses are already on the way. At the end of the day, we meet Vladislav and the body collectors again. Another 9 bodies found in this tour alone. And it's unlikely the last.
You know, we heard from the mayor of Bucha yesterday, John. He said the denazification by Russian troops is the dehumanization of Ukrainians, and I think we're seeing that in full effect there on the ground.
Yeah, indeed. And again, I just, the idea that there's a profession right now of body collectors in what will be many towns of Ukraine is chilling. And this morning, despite what the world is seeing in Bucha, the Russian Defense Ministry calls it fake and staged. But these new satellite images from Maxar Technology prove the bodies have been lying on the streets for weeks, including when the town was under Russian control. CNN's Nick Robertson is live in Brussels with the latest on this. We have the images from the satellites. We have our reporters on the ground, Nick, simply telling one story here despite what the Russians are saying.
Yeah, it's not just the defense minister. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, is jumping in on this as well, claiming that this is fake, that the Russians weren't in control of the town at the time. He said that the bodies had sort of suddenly appeared on lots of television outlets in the days that after Russian forces left on the 30th of March. The satellite images, though, do not lie. They tell a different story. They place the bodies on the streets of Bucha, exactly where reporters and Ukrainian government officials saw them when they drove into Bucha when the Russians left. They placed them there on the 18th of March, at a time very clearly when Russia was in control. Russia is trying to do what it's done in so many wars before, which is deny the obvious, lie and obfuscate, say that they aren't responsible, that it happened by other means. But now they're up against technology which can catch them out on their conspiracies and lies. And this is something Russians haven't faced before, and potentially this puts President Putin in a more precarious predicament when it comes to the potential prosecuting of him for war crimes. Not just President Biden saying he's committed war crimes, so many leaders here are as well. The President of the European Parliament, who was in Kyiv last weekend, called it a war crime. The President of the European Commission here, Ursula von der Leyen, going to Kyiv this week, has called it a war crime. So too the Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, Bulgarian, Finnish, Spanish, Austrian prime ministers all calling it a war crime. The Polish prime minister going further, calling it genocide. There is no doubt here that Russia's lies won't wash, and they have been exposed for what they are. John?
Yeah, and also President Zelensky, Nick, saying that it's going to be worse, right? These are towns and cities that have been cut off for so long, and this is the first glimpse that the world is getting. If it is worse, you know, what does that trigger? At what point does more accountability, is it trigger?
This is what the European Union is struggling with now, and I think many countries are. Their leaderships know that their publics are outraged. They are morally outraged as national leaders as well about what is happening. The European Union, they're sort of constrained to a degree by what they can do, what sanctions they can impose, by the pain it may inflict on their own countries, and trying to keep unity within the European Union. But the real struggle here is that the bigger the outrages become, the greater the pressures are on them to act. And you have, you know, there are some analyses that would say, don't go too far because you'll essentially potentially trigger World War III if you react too strongly. But undoubtedly, if more atrocities are unearthed, the pressure will grow, the sanctions will likely be stronger, the hands of the politicians here will be firmed up. It's an interesting point here to be made that Russia is using the tactics that it's always used in the past. But through history, we've seen that the side that has advantage of a new technology, be it going back to the Middle Ages and Henry V at Agincourt with his longbow archers, the English defeating the French, or First World War and the use of tanks, it gave those sides an advantage. Here, the advantage is on the side of those who can expose and tell the truth, and that is through the technologies, the satellite technology here that wasn't available in such real time in the public domain in previous wars, is now catching Russia out and may yet be part of their undoing. But how to undo them, that's the tough thing at the moment.
Indeed, look, we would hope the truth would be an advantage in and of itself. Nick Robertson in Brussels, thank you so much for your reporting.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called the killings of civilians in the town of Bucha war crimes and genocide. There is mounting international anger over images of mass graves and bodies showing signs of torture. Russia denies the accusations and says it will present evidence to the UN Security Council that its forces have not been involved in atrocities. A warning, our next report contains images that some viewers will find disturbing.
On the streets of Bucha, it looks as though Russian troops have only just been driven out. Many bodies of civilians have only just been recovered. The Ukrainian Interior Ministry invited journalists from around the world to come and document what took place here. Moscow has called these scenes a stage-managed anti-Russian provocation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is here to get a first-hand view. He's visibly emotional when he describes women who were raped in front of their children, entire families executed. He says his country must keep on fighting, but also negotiate.
Я вважаю, що
I'm convinced that we will achieve peace on Ukrainian territory. Ukraine cannot live in a constant state of war because this is Europe and this is the 21st century.
ми знаходимося в 21 сторіччі.
The Interior Ministry takes us on buses, through checkpoint after checkpoint, past the burnt-out remains of civilian vehicles. It's a dangerous trip. Our guide says he's expecting new attacks from Russia soon. In the village of Martishin, authorities take us to a site where 4 bodies were found, among them children.
Там от ямі.
My family is lying over there, in that hole. I don't know why they were killed. They were peace-loving, good people.
Абсолютно миролюбивими людьми. Добрими людьми.
Shortly afterwards, volunteers exhume the bodies and take them away.
This scum have tortured, beaten and murdered an entire family. They will be brought to justice. We will find all of those who carried out this terrible crime.
There are hundreds of bodies and very little time to give the victims a proper burial. These are also images from Bucha, mass graves. This woman buried her husband in her own backyard. She says she just wants peace.
I beg you, implore you, please do something. I'm talking to you as a Ukrainian wife, the mother of 2 children, and a grandmother.
For President Zelensky, Bucha is representative of what he calls the genocide Russia is committing all across Ukraine. He says the world must bear witness to it.
DW correspondent Nick Connolly was in Bucha on Monday and is now back in Kiev. Nick, good morning. Tell us what you saw in Bucha.
I saw a city that's basically been destroyed before it could be finished. It's a very young suburb of Kiev full of new high-rise apartments, most of which are basically left without any windows, half been up. Destroyed, burnt out Russian tanks on the streets, ammunition crates, just everywhere, bits of shrapnel. You get a sense of quite how intensive that fighting was over basically a month. Locals telling you that they basically were too scared to leave their homes and were sitting either at home or in their cellars for most of that time. And then stories, eyewitness accounts of those who did go out, who did venture out, often to try and look for food, seeing basically the streets strewn with bodies. They were telling me that basically the Russian soldiers were so, that they met at least, were so shocked by the level of resistance they had faced in Ukraine, something they hadn't expected, that they basically saw all the civilians around them as potential targets, as potential threats to their lives, and so they felt like they were walking along the streets, basically being watched through the sight of sniper rifles wherever they went. We went to the mass grave next to the church that some people might have seen images of. Seems like the locals dug that trench to recover bodies from the streets that had been lying there sometimes for days and weeks, and there were just layers upon layers of bodies. Some were buried in the clothes that they were wearing when they were killed, others covered in blankets, and then the top layer covered in kind of black plastic sacking. They seem to have done their best to try and reconstitute who these people are, to recover any ID that was on these people when they died, so that they can now try to attempt to contact the relatives and to work out who it is that's buried in these graves. We were also in a cellar of a children's summer camp where several people were executed. The bodies had been recovered by the authorities by the time we went there, but they had been photographed in earlier days by people I know personally, and you could just see traces of blood and bullets. So it's a very disorientating place to be, especially given that most of us journalists, we were just about 20-25 kilometers down the road here in the center of Kiev for most of that time. We could hear the shooting, we could hear the artillery in the distance, but we couldn't get there. Now, for the first time, we've actually been on the ground to see it for ourselves.
Nick, Russia has denied committing atrocities in Bucha and says that the killings were staged by Ukrainians. Now, you spoke to witnesses in Bucha. What did they tell you?
So they talk about people basically being killed on their way just to try and find some bread, to go find some food, people just disappearing randomly, everyone trying at that time to basically keep tabs on each other if they were leaving their homes, and then trying to go search for their relatives if they fail to come back at the agreed time. In terms of those claims coming out of Moscow, I haven't seen anything, any explanation on their part how this is meant to have happened. They've called it a provocation, but they haven't explained how these people died. They haven't ventured, as far as I've seen, any explanation that perhaps the Ukrainians would have killed their own people to create these images, to create this consternation and this anger towards the actions of the Russian army here. To me and to lots of Ukrainians, it seems like a distraction tactic, the kind of thing that we saw after the Malaysian Boeing MH17 was knocked out of the sky, was downed in the summer of 2014, where lots of aircraft were advanced and then dropped within a matter of weeks. And I think the main kind of target, the main reason for those kinds of statements was basically just to distract and to confuse in the hope that people would lose interest and not keep their attention focused on these things. In the end, we saw that Dutch international investigation was able to identify the people responsible for firing that Buk missile that brought that plane down, killing hundreds of civilians. It took years, but they got there in the end. And lots of people I spoke to in Bucha are hoping that that's also going to happen here. There's already a lot of information being gathered and people being asked to tell their stories to the authorities.
That was our correspondent Nick Connolly in Kiev. Well, those discoveries we mentioned earlier in Bucha have prompted Germany to expel 40 Russian diplomats. France and Lithuania have announced similar moves. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said Germany would also boost its support for Ukraine's armed forces and tighten economic sanctions against Russia.
Berlin is shocked by the images of Russia's attack on Bucha. Germany's foreign minister spoke of crimes against humanity that will be countered with immediate weapons supplies to Kyiv. We will strengthen our support for Ukraine's defense. Bucha and Mariupol have shown us this is a life or death situation for millions of Ukrainians. We are considering delivering weapon systems that we had held back until now. On top of this, the German government has declared that 40 diplomats from the Russian embassy are now persona non grata and will be expelled from the country. And the voices demanding an immediate halt to all Russian gas imports are growing louder. Politicians say it's not possible. According to the economy minister, Germany was following the wrong energy policy for far too long. We are now reversing our energy policy. Every day we are working towards creating the preconditions necessary for an embargo. And it's my opinion and that of the government that this is the correct way to proceed. And once carried out, it will harm Putin on a daily basis. A gas embargo would hit Germany's middle class the hardest. The opposition CDU warns that this must be taken into consideration. It's not only important to think about how this will affect Russia, it's also very important to measure the effects this will have on millions of Germans. This is a deciding factor. This is why we should exit our dependence on oil and coal consumption quickly, but reduce gas consumption more slowly. To enable the continual supply of gas, Germany has decided to appoint the Federal Network Agency as trustee for the German subsidiary of Russia's Gazprom. Further sanctions against Russia will be decided together with the EU. The Commission has already recommended more disciplinary measures.
DW political correspondent Emmanuel Chaz is covering this story and joins us now. Emma, Germany says it will impose more sanctions on Russia following the discovery of those apparent atrocities in Bucha. What kind of sanctions are we talking about?
Well, first off, Terry, we've just seen in the report this is very significant because Germany has been criticized also by its Western allies for opposing, for example, a full embargo on Russian gas, for taking too long to decide on sending weapons, which now the country has pledged to do. And now we see Germany imposing those further sanctions. Dozens of Russian diplomats have been expelled. Minister Annalena Baerbock saying that those envoys, I quote, have worked every day here in Germany against our freedom, against our cohesion, the cohesion of our society. Annalena Baerbock also said that Germany will no longer tolerate this. The people expelled will have 5 days to leave the country. This is just a first reaction to the atrocities committed in Bucha. More are to come with Chancellor Olaf snapshots saying that those are being discussed with Western allies at the moment. They will be aimed at economically weakening Russia. We can think of more sanctions on Putin and his circles,